Picture this: a tiny hut, somewhere on the edge of a frozen valley. The wind scratches at the walls, the fire gasps for breath, and I press a glowing stone to my baby's chest so it won't turn blue before sunrise. Now picture another world. A sun-drenched palace far to the south, where a queen walks barefoot across marble floors that still remember the desert heat. Two worlds, one ruled by frost, the other by fire. And yet, our survival depends on the same secret. Tonight, I'll take you from the ashes of northern villages to the golden dust of forgotten kingdoms, to uncover the secret world of queens and servants. Good evening, traveler. Before we begin, dim the lights. Let the room fall quiet. Maybe you're listening from a narrow apartment in the city, where rain brushes the glass like a patient hand. Or maybe you're somewhere still, a cabin, a study, a train that hums beneath your seat. Wherever you are, breathe slow. Imagine the hum of an old hearth, the scent of smoke and damp earth curling together. That's where I am as I speak, not in a palace, not among silks or marble, but here, where warmth is a fragile thing we must make ourselves. You'll hear the wind from time to time. Don't let it unsettle you. It's only the north reminding us that comfort was once a form of defiance. If you wish, whisper, just softly, where you're listening from. It's a small ritual I like. A way to remind myself that somewhere out there, across centuries and miles, warmth still connects us. Because that's where our story begins, in the quiet between breaths, in a place where warmth meant life and silence meant death. They said our fires once sang in the night. Not in words, not in music, but in a low trembling hum that could travel through the bones of a sleeping child. The elders called it the breath of Elandra, the goddess who first taught us how to feed the flame without burning our fingers. When I was small, I thought the sound was only the wind slipping through the gaps in the roofs. But later, when I found the old clay tablets buried under frost and ash, I realized they were right. The fires did sing. Before the frost took dominion, before kings claimed the rivers and priests claimed the stars, there was only the valley of Valmir and the people who lived as if time were a circle instead of a line. Our world was small enough to walk across in a day and vast enough to spend a lifetime understanding. In the mornings, smoke rose from hundreds of thatched huts, thin blue lines weaving through the air like threads in a single cloth. Children ran barefoot across frozen mud, their laughter sharp as birdsong. The women, my ancestors, sang while stirring their iron pots, voices so even they could keep the rhythm of the day by ear. The men carved tools from horn and stone, cutting new teeth for old plows, patching sleds before the next storm. It was not a world of heroes. It was a world of work. We had no written words then, only stories painted on bark or carved into doorframes. Every symbol was a prayer disguised as a picture. The circle for warmth, the downward arrow for hunger, the spiral for the turning of the year. My grandmother told me that each mark was a promise made to the next generation, proof that they had endured another winter, that the frost had not yet swallowed their names. I still see their marks sometimes, half buried in the ruins when the thaw comes. The spiral is always the clearest. It seems to glow faintly when the morning sun hits the ice. Our lives revolved around the river Kareth. It wasn't wide or deep, but it never froze completely, even in the blackest months. The people said Elandra's tears kept it flowing, that she wept for those who died in the cold, and her sorrow warmed the current. We believed her tears tasted faintly of salt, though the sea was 1,000 miles away. Every year, when the first frost painted the grass silver, the villagers would gather at the riverbank to thank her. They'd drop small gifts into the water. Bits of woven cloth, carved wooden hands, the first embers of the new season's fire wrapped in clay. Then they'd watch until the offerings disappeared beneath the current, carried south to the lands we only knew from rumor. The warm kingdoms, the cities of stone, the people who lived without fear of freezing. Back then, our fear was simple. You could smell it in the air, the dread of the long dark. But it was not despair. It was respect. The frost was not our enemy, it was a guest that stayed too long. The people of Valmir measured their lives by the breath of seasons. Spring was short and merciful, summer brief and fierce, autumn a slow surrender. Winter was the truest teacher. It made philosophers of farmers and saints of shepherds. In that endless cold, even cruelty softened. You could not afford to hate when you needed every hand to keep the fire alive. We had no kings, only elders chosen by memory. A person became wise not by power, but by how many winters they could recount without forgetting the faces of the lost. My ancestor Elda, who lived 8 generations before me, was one of these memory keepers. Her voice, they said, was so clear it could still a storm. When the young grew restless and spoke of conquering the southern valleys, she would remind them, the frost is not conquered. It is borrowed from year to year. Her words were carved above the hearth of every home until the fire took them. The hearth was the center of everything. Birth, death, marriage, and prayer all began and ended beside it. To let the fire die was to invite silence, and silence, we believed, was the first sign of death. Each evening before sleep, families buried a coal in a bed of ash, whispering the night prayer. Rest but do not fade. By dawn, they'd uncover it and breathe life back into the flame. In this way, one day's warmth became the seed of the next. Sometimes I dream of that rhythm, the quiet exchange of breath between people and fire. I can almost hear the sigh of the coals when air touches them, that small miracle of orange life. The valley had its dangers, wolves, famine, fever. But they were familiar enemies. Predictable. The frost had its rules and we had learned to obey them. Our true peril came later when the rules themselves change. But before that, the world still made sense. There was laughter even in hunger. The first snow always brought music. The villagers carved hollow reeds and blew across them, mimicking the sound of wind so the spirits would think the storm already lived among us and pass by. Children painted their faces with ash to confuse the cold. Lovers met secretly in the smokehouses, pretending to check on the drying meat while sharing stolen heat. We were not innocent, but we were whole. And though we knew nothing of kings or palaces, we believed in the southern light. Every child in Valmir grew up hearing the same legend. That far beyond the White Mountains lay a land where warmth never ended, where gold dust covered the ground, and where women ruled by the rhythm of the sun. We called it Sethem, though none had seen it. The traders who passed through spoke of strange fruits that burned the tongue, of towers that glowed at dusk, of a queen who could make rain by whispering to her reflection. To us, these were stories meant to balance the cold. If we had Elandra's tears, they had the sun's breath. It seemed fair. The elders taught that the world was not divided by good and evil, but by temperature. Too much of either, and life faltered. The art of living was to walk between heat and frost without surrendering to either. That belief shaped everything. Our rituals, our medicine, our sense of justice. When someone committed a crime, they were not punished by blade or chain but by solitude, sent to live beyond the firelight until they remembered what warmth meant. It was harsh, but it worked. No one stayed cold forever. When I first began studying the remnants of their lives, the soot patterns on stones, the alignment of charred hearths, I realized something strange. Every home in Valmir faced slightly east, toward the first light of morning. Not south, where warmth would have been greater. Not north, toward the mountains. East, as if the entire village turned its face each day to greet something older than the sun itself. Perhaps they knew even then that their survival depended on remembering the dawn. I often wonder what they felt on the night before it all changed. Did they sense the air thickening? Did the elders hear the wind falter, the silence before the frost struck too soon? Or did they sleep peacefully, believing, as every generation does, that the world would wake the same as yesterday? When I touch the cracked stones of the old hearths, I swear I can still feel the pulse of that last season, the faint warmth of a civilization that lived by the grace of flame. They had no word for extinction, only forgetting, and perhaps that is the truest definition of death, not the absence of breath, but the loss of memory. So I remember for them. I remember the way smoke stitched the sky into ribbons. I remember the laughter between snowstorms, the soft argument between frost and fire, the faces lit from below by embers. I remember their faith in rhythm, their belief that everything could be mended if only the flame was shared. That was the world before kings. Before the frost grew impatient. Before warmth became a secret. That was Valmir, our cradle of smoke and song. And though centuries have turned to dust, I can still hear it. The faint hum beneath the ice, the ghost of our first fire, waiting to be remembered. They said the wind learned new words that year. Not the gentle syllables it used to carve across our roofs, but a harsher grammar that scraped the valley raw. Long before anyone named the disaster, the animals knew. The goats cropped the last yellow threads of grass and would not climb. The crows gathered on the boundary stones and stared, unblinking, toward the north as if watching a door we could not see. Children woke from ordinary dreams and could not stop shivering, even in their mother's arms. These are the small notices history never writes down, the quiet amendments before the law changes. I have walked the fields where our barley once stood. In the right light, you can still see the harvest lines, ghost furrows pressed into the earth like memory's fingerprints. The stalks should have ripened 2 weeks more, but the cold arrived early, a pale breath that frosted kernels hard as glass. The first frost always came with iron courtesy, tapping at the edges, begging permission. That year it crossed the threshold without knocking. Smoke told the tale better than any elder. On good mornings the valley wore 100 thin braids of blue, each one rising from a hearth and twining into the sky. We knew one another's wellness by those braids. A missing plume sent neighbors to knock. But the week the river's song thinned, smoke began to change. It climbed a little, hesitated, and fell like tired cloth. People said the wood was damp. They said they would gather drier logs after noon. They said a great many things, the way the living do when truth sits down among them and refuses to be recognized. The river Kerith, our patient companion, took on a glassy stare. Ice bloomed first along the stones where the water wrinkled, clear petals that seemed harmless, even pretty. The fishwives shrugged and broke them with their poles. But the bloom spread. At twilight it sealed the lazy pools, by dawn it stitched the shallows, by the third morning it sealed a slow-moving bend where children loved to throw pebbles and count the ripples. They threw and got no answer. The elders met. They always met when the seasons misbehaved, not to command the weather but to command themselves. Elda, our ancient memory keeper, had gone to smoke 2 winters earlier. But her daughter, Sarat, wore the spiral amulet and spoke with the kind of careful boldness that makes people listen. She said the cold was not an enemy but a messenger, and messengers should be answered with order. So she adjusted the rationing table, counted the sacks of pulse and dried meat, reassigned the young to haul wood, reassigned the old to teach calm. What is calm but a woven thing? It frays first where hands are roughest. The thatchers muttered that the frost meant ill will from the high pastures. The drovers blamed the miller blamed the river offered no defense. Still, days passed, and order held. Fires needed more coaxing, ovens complained, sleep grew lighter. When people dreamed now, they dreamed of cracking. I have read the ash ledgers we kept during the hungry years. Thin tablets scored with marks to track whose hearth had borrowed coal from whom. The early pages look like lattice, neat, crisscrossed favors, warmth moving gently between houses as always. Then the lines turn jagged. Names repeat, symbols crowd. The spiral that meant, the turning of the year, appears in margins beside a new tiny mark no one had used before. A crooked star, drawn when a hearth went out entirely. The first star belonged to the potter, Darren. He was a generous man, and generosity is a poor shelter in sudden storms. He'd given extra warmth to a family with a newborn, rightly, goodly, and trusted his kiln's heat to carry him through the night. The kiln failed. By morning, the potter's hands looked dipped in chalk. He stood at Sarat's door with a boy's apology in an old man's mouth. They rekindled him. They tried to pretend the new mark had no meaning beyond the day. The second star came 2 nights later. Then 4 on the following page. Then 9 more cramped together in the ledger's brittle corner. Smoke did not braid anymore. It staggered, and in the workshops, the little sanctuaries where skill kept winter at bay, things began to forget how to become themselves. Clay lost its memory of shape. Bread lost its memory of rise. Even the iron in the smith's forge seemed to recall a colder ore-bound life and resist the hammer's persuasion. It is strange how quickly prayer changes its address. People stopped speaking to the frost and started speaking past it. They asked Elandra, goddess of warmth, to take pity. They promised to carry coals more faithfully. They promised to share without counting. At night they pressed warm stones to infants' chests and sang the old songs with lips so dry the vowels cracked. You could hear the valley breathing, shallow, measured, as if hoping the cold would not notice. I am told there was beauty, too. Even terror wears a kind of ceremony. The moon shone on the ice with a saint's indifferent clarity. The snow made an honest ledger of footsteps, every kindness, every theft recorded in white. Children, forbidden to play far from doors, learned to make theaters in the shapes their breath left on window ice. Lovers sat back to back and passed a single cup of nettle tea forward, then back, so neither would have to remove their hands from the other's spine. On the 7th night of the new frost, the sky turned the color of iron water. Winds from the high pass came carrying the bitter powder we called mountain flower, a dry sting that sneaks beneath doorframes and settles on tongues. The old said that kind of wind arrived only after midwinter, never so early. The old fell silent. The dogs would not bark. Somewhere up valley, a pine cracked with the gunshot sound trees make when their water freezes too quickly. That evening Sarah ordered the great burying. Every home was to hide 2 coals instead of 1. Not for themselves but for the house named after them on a lot-drawn list. Warmth was to move even when people could not. The standing rule, rest but do not fade, was amended by a sharper line. If you have 2 flames, you are responsible for 3 lives. The edict traveled mouth to mouth like necessary bread. For a night, fear obeyed. Then came the harvest's end that never ended. The last carts lurched home through ruts that glittered solid by noon. The grain inside smelled wrong, an early sour, damp even where no dampness had been. Families tied their sacks above the floor to keep them from absorbing the cold's hunger. They told jokes about the time the year forgot how to count. They looked at one another too often. On the 12th morning, smoke failed entirely in the northern lane. 7 huts in a row lifted nothing to the sky. Neighbors went with covered pans, found ash as chill as river stone, found men with frost-chapped lips making jokes they did not believe, found women rubbing their own arms as if bodies were flints that might spark if struck long enough. The ashkeepers, the families who specialized in carrying coals wrapped in clay, walked the lane and felt their own pans leach heat into hungry rooms. They moved faster. The rooms were hungrier. I do not know how to write the sound of a valley when hope begins to lower its voice. The best I can do is tell you how people started to stand closer without noticing. How they spoke with their faces tilted to catch one another's breath. How the ground acquired a faint litany of dropped things, a spoon, a mitten, a single seed, that no one stooped to claim because stooping spent heat. That afternoon, with dusk limping early down the hill, the first hearth went dark in the southern row. The cook, Madra, had been famous for keeping soup a heartbeat from boiling through any winter. She slapped the side of her pot as if coaxing a stubborn mule. The soup mirrored her palm with a dull skin. That slap echoed. One of those human noises that carries secret meanings, and doors opened up and down the row. People watched from thresholds. No one crossed the packed snow between. They were saving steps. Saving steps is how you begin to lose a town. Night fell with a dry hiss. Sarah called the bell 3 times and no more. Metal killed warmth worse than water did. The elders gathered at the communal hall, where the great hearth should have made a lake of light. It made a puddle. They made plans like weavings, tugging the warp of rationing through the weft of mercy. A girl arrived as they argued, hair stiff with frost, eyes waterless, and whispered into Sarah's sleeve that her baby brother's lips had turned a color no one had a name for. The elders ran out into the cold like forgetful children. In later tellings, the moment that followed arrives like a myth, too clean, too bright to have been born from real fear. But I have weighed the tablets and sat with the last eyewitness, a woman who lived to see 3 summers after that winter and no more. She swore the truth is smaller and heavier than myth. A presence that did not announce itself. A figure already there when you realized you were not alone. He stood at the longhouse threshold, where the draft makes a serpent of smoke. Cloaked, silent, eyes like coals that had learned the patience of stones. Some said snow did not settle on his shoulders. Others said it did, and melted as they watched. He didn't stamp his boots. He did not breed clouds. He carried in one gloved hand a small leather pouch that looked too thin to be useful. No one in Valmir had room for strangers that week, not even the polite kind. But desperation summons manners like hunger summons the memory of recipes. Sarah stepped forward with her palms open, no priestly gesture, only the village habit of showing you carried no blade, and asked him whether he needed warmth or could share it. She meant it as a test. He took it as permission. He opened the pouch. Inside lay a handful of dust the color of river ice when moonlight finds it, blue, but not the blue of sky or bruise or cold. A working blue. He pinched a bit between finger and thumb and cast it toward the hearth, not into the heart of the embers as any of us would, but into their shadow. The dust did not fall so much as decide to arrive. We learned many things in a single breath. We learned that fire can remember itself. We learned that shadows are not empty. We learned that a room can flinch. The hearth answered, not with a pop or a crackle or any of the domestic sounds that make comfort sound like itself, but with a deep inhalation, as if the flame had been a drowning thing and someone had finally cut the surface for it to breathe. The coals rolled their dull eyes open. Heat moved out and then back, like a startled animal reconsidering flight. The man cast a second pinch. The blue dust hung in the air the way ash does when a story is about to be told. This time the flame rose, not high, not showy, but with a stubbornness I have seen in midwives and muleteers. Light rubbed itself along the rafters. The hall smelled suddenly of peat and old summers. People began to cry without knowing it. The girl with the brother who had no color left his mother's shawl and crept close enough to feel her cheeks ache with the pleasure pain of thaw. Someone whispered Elandra. Someone whispered witch. Sarah said nothing. She watched the man's hands. She watched the places he chose, the corners where cold makes dens. She watched how little of the dust he used and how much difference it made. She watched the wind die against the door as if it had reconsidered our worth. By then, word had run like bare feet through snow. Families came carrying bowls, pans, anything that could cradle coals, anything that could be convinced to act like a womb. The stranger did not bless them. He did not teach. He moved along the line of vessels and, when a particular pot or lid pleased him, he tipped a breath's worth of blue into it. He never touched the children, yet each child leaned toward him as seedlings lean toward a remembered son. He left before dawn. Of course he did. Dawn is the hour when gifts look like mistakes and the unexplainable asks to be renamed. He stepped out through the threshold serpent of smoke and into the white that waited as if it had not been watching. He left no footprints that anyone could keep, though old Emma swore she saw the snow soften where he passed, as if frost itself had been made to hesitate. We did not follow. We did what the living always do when a miracle bolts through the room like a frightened deer. We pretended we had expected it, and then we set about making rules for its keeping. When the stranger was gone and the snow had swallowed his trail, the people of Valmir stood as souls newly awakened, blinking in the raw morning. The fire he had kindled within our hall still breathed, and its warmth felt unlike any flame before it, deep, steady, obedient to will. We tended it as though it were a wounded beast that might yet run away. In those first days, none dared sleep long. Men and women kept vigil in turns, whispering the old prayers yet uncertain to whom they were now addressed. I have read that dawn in the fragments of ash that remain. They bear the scent of wonder mingled with fear. For when a gift descends unearned, it must be caged in meaning lest it unmake the giver. Thus began the shaping of order. Sarat, the elder who had faced the stranger, called together the warmest minds of her generation. They gathered within the great hall, now bright as summer though the blizzard howled without, and spoke until their voices rasped. From their council was born the first covenant of flame. They decreed that no fire should henceforth belong to one house alone. Each hearth would yield a portion of its breath to its neighbor. Each neighbor would receive in return. Warmth was declared a current, not a possession. To guard this sacred exchange, certain families were chosen, those whose hands were steady and whose hearts were patient, to bear embers between dwellings. These were the first ashkeepers. Their duty was not only carriage but memory. To know which home's spark had fathered which, to trace the lineage of every light. In their keeping, warmth became genealogy. I imagined them walking the lanes by night, faces veiled against the wind, clay pans cradled to their chests. The glow within those pans must have seemed a piece of the stranger himself. When they arrived at a door, they bowed, not as servants but as priests performing a sacrament. In that ritual motion, a society was remade. The first generation kept the practice simple, ember for ember, favor for favor. Yet as winters cycled and the tale of the blue dust spread, understanding thickened into creed. The children who had watched the stranger's hands grew old and told their grandchildren that the dust had been no mortal thing but the breath of Elandra restored to earth. They taught that the goddess had sent a messenger in man's guise to test whether mortals could bear the burden of divine heat without greed. Thus theology clothed the miracle, and the covenant hardened into law. The ashkeepers built their hall at the river's bend where the ice had first refused to form. There they kept the great ember, said to be descended unbroken from the stranger's fire. It was tended day and night, never allowed to fade, its ashes sifted and divided into countless small stones that could hold warmth for a season. These stones became tokens of trust, traded as payment and pledge. The market of Valmir, once filled with hides and barley, began to glitter with their dull red light. A loaf of bread might be bought with a stone still faintly warm. A debt might be sealed by surrendering one's portion of heat. So commerce learned the language of flame. In time the keepers grew numerous. They formed ranks and signs, measured breath and burn, and spoke in terms that mingled devotion with craft. They learned that ash, when buried with care, could preserve the ghost of fire even through long storms. They built vaults in the earth lined with blackened brick, where the warmth of a whole village could sleep till called upon. I have walked among those vaults in my own age. They lie collapsed, yet when one breaks a stone within, it still exhales a sigh of ancient heat, as though remembering its purpose. From such beginnings rose hierarchy. The eldest keepers, whose hands bore the fewest scars, were deemed purest. They alone could approach the great ember without veil. Beneath them served the journeymen, who carried fire between districts, and beneath these the novices, children chosen each spring by lottery to learn the breath pattern of warmth. In through the nose, out through the heart. To be chosen was honor and peril, for the training demanded long hours near the blaze, and many were burned before they learned the gentleness required to command flame. Around these orders gathered belief. The villagers built shrines in every lane, small alcoves where a single coal rested under glass. Travelers bowed to these as they passed, touching the glass for luck. The act left smudges of soot shaped like fingerprints, black constellations of faith scattered through the town. Even death was rewritten. When one died, a keeper knelt by the body and placed a cooled stone upon the chest, whispering that the spirit's warmth might find its way home. Graves glowed faintly for nights afterward, until rain washed the last ember into the soil. Generations rolled. The covenant prospered and, as all prosperities do, began to calcify. Where once warmth had moved freely, now permits and seals were required. Each household owed a tithe of coal to the keeper's hall, and those who withheld were named chillborn, outcasts condemned to sleep without fire until forgiveness thawed. Children feared the chillborn tales more than wolves. Parents invoked them to enforce obedience. Thus mercy gave birth to discipline, and the breath of Elondra grew administrative. Trade widened. Merchants from southern valleys came seeking the famed warm stones. They carried them away in packs, selling them in lands where the sun ruled harshly and nights were starved of comfort. Gold returned to Valmir in exchange, and with gold came envy. Families not born to the keeper line petitioned for shares in the market. Denied, they began to mimic the rituals in secret, burning impure powders and claiming blessings. The first heresies flared like sparks upon dry straw. The elders answered with decrees and inspections, until even belief itself required license. Yet amid the thickening of rule, the old compassion still glimmered. Every year, on the longest night, the keepers opened their hall to all. They would carry the great ember through the streets upon a bronze dish, its glow licking the falling snow, while people knelt and warmed their hands upon the air. It was said that the ember sang softly then, a tone between sigh and memory. I sometimes think it was the last time the valley truly breathed as one body. As centuries folded upon centuries, the system expanded beyond its cradle. Valmir's daughters married into distant towns, taking the custom of shared flame with them. What began as covenant became culture, and culture grew into empire. In the south, where the air itself shimmered with heat, the practice was adapted in reverse. They learned to cool rather than to warm, to bury water jars in shadowed pits and speak blessings over wind. Thus was born the dual faith, frost-born and sun-born, each claiming descent from the same blue dust. And from that division would arise both greatness and ruin. I look back upon those first ash-keepers with sorrow and admiration. They did not seek power, yet power sought them. They wished only to preserve the miracle, but preservation is merely conquest slowed to ceremony. What they built endured far longer than any single fire, it shaped thought itself. Even now, in lands where winter is a story and the frost a myth, people still speak of warmth as though it were a moral quality. They say a kind heart is one that burns gently. They do not know they are repeating the lessons of Valmir. Sometimes, when I walk among the ruins at dusk, the ground releases faint threads of steam where old hearths once stood. I kneel, place my palm upon the stone, and feel the echo of those ancient trades, the murmur of commerce, the rustle of devotion, the measured breaths of the keepers counting their coals. All systems, I have learned, begin with gratitude and end with ownership. The miracle becomes a ledger, the prayer becomes a policy. Yet beneath the soot, the first intention still lives, waiting for someone to remember that warmth was never meant to be hoarded. Thus ended the first age of our valley, the age when flame became faith, and faith became rule. And though time has scattered both, I can still sense their pattern, like embers beneath ash, dull yet living, whispering that every system begins as love misunderstood. They say a single spark may outlive the hand that kindled it. Thus it was with Mira, daughter of Sarat, born beneath the waning light of the Covenant's first century. The snow that year fell so softly that people mistook it for blessing. Mira's cry, when it came, was fierce enough to rattle the copper pans above the hearth. The midwife laughed and said the child had lungs made of flame. In later years the same would be said of her temper, her mercy, and her strange gift for coaxing warmth from dying coals. I, who have studied her name scratched upon the old tablets, think she carried in her blood the last pure echo of the stranger's fire. From youth she was restless among the keepers. The hall had grown solemn, its prayers weighed down with rule and tithe. Mira loved the work but hated the ceremony. When others chanted invocations before the great ember, she knelt in silence, listening instead to the soft breathing of the flame itself. She said it spoke in pulses, a rhythm older than speech, and that if one breathed in time with it the world would answer. The elders smiled at her simplicity, calling it piety. They did not see how closely curiosity and devotion walk. In the valley's 5th month of thaw she began tending the sick. Warmth, she said, was not only for the living well but for the failing. She pressed heated stones to the chests of fevered children, guided her breath into theirs, and watched the frost of death withdraw from their lips. Her fame spread quietly, a rumor first whispered by mothers, then by the merchants who came to barter for firestones. They called her the Hearth Daughter, and some swore that when she passed through the market, candles straightened their flames as if greeting kin. The keepers at first praised her. Every miracle strengthens a temple's name, but power is a jealous custodian. When folk began seeking her counsel rather than the eldest keepers, unease took root. They summoned her before the ember to explain her methods. Mira spoke plainly. That heat was a gift to all, and that one could heal by sharing it freely, not by measure or decree. The chamber grew still. Such words struck at the foundation of their order, yet they were delivered with a gentleness that forbade anger. The eldest dismissed her without punishment, hoping silence would dull her flame. Silence never does. That winter the frost came early again. Houses cracked. The great ember's glow waned for the first time in memory. The keepers, fearing omen, forbade the distribution of coals until purification rites could be performed. People waited in darkened homes while the river smoked with cold. On the 3rd night Mira broke the command. She gathered what embers she could, hid them in her cloak, and went door to door. At each threshold she whispered the same words. Fire does not ask who it warms. By dawn, half the village glowed again, and the frost retreated as though shamed. When the elders learned, they summoned her not to question but to condemn. The hall filled with witnesses, their faces flickering red and black. Mira stood alone before the great ember. She did not plead. She said only that warmth kept by fear would die of loneliness. The sentence was exile until thaw, a mercy that, in those months, meant near certain death. Yet she bowed, took a small ember in a clay bowl, and walked into the white. What happened after lives half in record, half in dream? Some claimed she built a shelter in the eastern woods, that animals gathered round her at night as if drawn by some remembered sprain. Others said she wandered the high ridges, speaking with the wind itself. In truth, no one saw her until the thaw, when shepherd boys found her hut smoldering in the meltwater hollow. The roof had fallen, the walls were black glass. In the ashes they found the bowl unbroken, the ember within still red, and beside it a newborn child wrapped in Myra's cloak. She had kept the flame alive for another. The village took the child in and named her Liana, the bound one, for she was tied by birth to 2 worlds, the living and the ash. As Liana grew, the keepers marked her as omen and heir. They hoped to mold her into obedience, but she bore her mother's quiet defiance. She learned the old rites quickly, then questioned them faster. If flame is alive, she asked once, why do we cage it? No one answered. At night she would sneak to the river, tracing spirals in the mud, murmuring to the water as if speaking to a twin. The older she grew, the more she felt the valley shrinking around her. The great ember's light seemed heavy now, its warmth thick with duty. The stories said the south was different, that there the sun moved unhindered, and queens ruled by the rhythm of heat and sand. Liana began to dream of that brightness. When she was 16, a band of traders from Sethem arrived with their long-necked beasts and shining fabrics. Among their wares were copper mirrors, rare in Valmir. Liana looked into one and saw her mother's eyes, storm gray, unflinching. Something in her heart cracked like thawing ice. That night she left, slipping through the sleeping lanes with a single warm stone in her palm. By morning, the trail of her footprints had melted clean away. The records grow sparse after that. The keepers noted her departure with the phrase "returned to the journey," the polite term for loss. Yet tales followed. A healer seen in the southern passes, a northern girl who could calm fever by touch. In the markets of Sethem she was said to move among servants, learning tongues and herbs, her hands smelling faintly of smoke. I have seen fragments of letters written in the slanted script of that empire, praising a foreign woman who tamed the air with breath. Whether this was Liana or legend, no scholar can swear. Still, I believe she lived. For a generation later, inscriptions appear in the southern archives bearing a symbol unknown before: the spiral of Valmir, carved beside the sign of the sun. In that union of marks lies proof enough. The north had touched the south, frost had met flame, and out of their meeting rose a new creed. That power lies not in the keeping of warmth but in its exchange. Myra's story did not end with her ashes, nor Liana's with her flight. Their names thread through centuries like veins of light in stone. In each retelling, the details differ, but the core endures. A woman defied law for compassion, and from her defiance came change. Even now, when the wind turns cruel, mothers press hot stones to their children's chests and whisper Myra's words. They no longer remember her face, but the warmth remembers her. When I close my eyes, I see that hut in the hollow, fire dancing behind its broken walls. I hear the child's faint cry, the sigh of coals settling as if in answer. The world outside is frozen, yet within that small circle of light life endures. Perhaps every age must rediscover that truth for itself. That systems decay, that faith turns to ash, but the human hand still reaches instinctively toward heat. We are born of that gesture. We survive by it. And somewhere, beneath every doctrine and every empire's marble chill, a single ember waits for breath. Sedhem was another world entirely, a vast mirror turned toward the sun. Its cities rose from the sand like prayers cast in gold, its air smelled of spice and iron, and its people moved with the unhurried grace of those who have never known frost. When I first read the records of that empire, I could scarcely believe such warmth existed beyond imagination. Yet it was there that the child of Valmir, Liana, daughter of Mira, grew into legend, and there that the covenant of fire took on a new and perilous shape. The traders who carried her south did not know her story. They saw only a pale girl with eyes like storm water, silent but keen. She served first as a bearer, then as a scribe, for her memory was sharp and her hands steady. The journey took months. Across passes that smelled of salt and stone, through forests where the air thickened with heat until breath itself felt heavy. When they reached the plains of Sedhem, she saw for the first time what endless sunlight could do. Fields glimmered with ripening grain, rivers shone like molten bronze, and above it all loomed the domes of the capital, Sharan, the city of thousand mirrors. To those born beneath such brilliance, shadow was a thing to fear. The Sedhemians prayed to their own goddess, Sura, mistress of radiance, who demanded purity through exposure. They built temples open to the sky, where the faithful stood in lines to receive the burning gaze of the sun. Darkness was considered ignorance, and coolness a form of sin. Servants fanned courtyards not for comfort but to remind the wealthy that air itself was theirs to command. It was a kingdom intoxicated by light. Liana entered this world as a servant in the palace kitchens. She was quick to learn their speech, though she never lost the quiet cadence of the north. At night, when others slept, she pressed her palm against the earthen walls and whispered to them, releasing tiny breaths of warmth she carried still from her mother's gift. The cooks found that their ovens drew more evenly when she was near. The stewards remarked that spoilage lessened. Within a year she was summoned to the household of the queen. Queen Aridel was a widow of 29, young by the empire's measure but already weary of its glare. Her chambers were vast and windowless, a rebellion whispered in stone. When she first saw Liana tending the lamps, she asked why the servant shielded their flames with glass. To keep them breathing, Liana answered. The queen, accustomed to flattery, heard instead a kind of wisdom. She kept the girl near. From that day began a quiet education. Aridel, who ruled a court obsessed with spectacle, found solace in this northern stranger who spoke little and listened much. Liana learned to read the Sedhemian tongue, then the languages of the older dynasties. She spent long hours in the royal library, tracing her finger along scrolls so ancient that the ink bled into her skin. It was there she discovered the forgotten chronicles of Maris, a desert city that had once been governed by women scholars, the servant queens who balanced fire and water, command and humility. Their philosophy was simple yet profound, that the ruler must learn to serve the elements before commanding them. The idea struck her like lightning upon ice. In those words she heard an echo of Valmir, of Myra's teaching that warmth must be shared or die. She began to see connections where others saw contrast, the sun and the flame, the frost and the shadow. At night she filled pages with notes in 2 languages, building bridges between the northern breath and the southern blaze. Aradel encouraged her. The queen herself was a prisoner of ceremony, forced to perform divinity before men who measured her worth in gold and suns. Liana's presence reminded her of humanity unshackled from ritual. Together they experimented in secret, blending northern breath practices with southern invocations of light. They found that by alternating heat and coolness, they could temper metals to impossible strength, soothe fevers, even calm tempests of the heart. Aradel called it the union of elements, Liana, more simply, the balance. But the court watched. In a city built upon sunlight, whispers travel like reflections. The high priests of Sura grew uneasy at the queen's new devotion to a nameless art. They called it heresy to cool the body deliberately, to breathe as though heat were not holy. Aradel ignored them at first, wrapping herself in new understanding, finding in Liana's counsel the courage she had never found in crowns. Yet every miracle births envy. The ministers murmured that the queen was bewitched by a foreign girl whose eyes carried winter within them. Meanwhile, the union spread quietly among servants. Liana taught them to balance flame and water in the kitchens, to temper food as one tempers steel. The dishes grew gentler, the air less oppressive. Even the palace gardens began to change. They planted silver-leafed trees from the north that thrived in shade. The people called this the cool season, and though it lasted only months, none who lived through it forgot its peace. Then came the drought. For 7 weeks no rain fell. The priests declared it punishment for the queen's defiance. They demanded sacrifices, but Aradel refused. She ordered Liana to the royal terrace, where they performed the ancient rite of Maris, alternating bowls of water and fire, breath and stillness. On the 3rd night clouds gathered over the desert, and the first drops fell. To the watchers below it seemed as if the northern servant had summoned the storm. The miracle saved the harvest and doomed its makers. The priests convened the High Council, accusing Liana of sorcery, of resurrecting the forbidden cult of Maris. They claimed she had seduced the queen with whispers of darkness. Aradel stood before them, unafraid, and declared that light without shadow was blindness. Her words echoed through the marble halls, shaking the very mirrors that lined them. Yet power fears balance more than rebellion. Liana was taken from the palace that night. Some said she went willingly, others that she vanished as smoke does when a wind changes. The queen searched every chamber, every street, until the priests forbade her from speaking the girl's name. Aradel withdrew from court life soon after, ruling only through decrees sent from her shadowed rooms. Those who glimpsed her in later years swore she carried a small stone pendant that glowed faintly when touched. As for Liana, her story fractured into myth. Sailors told of a woman who walked the dunes barefoot, leaving green shoots where her steps fell. Monks in the northern passes spoke of a wanderer who carried a bowl of living embers that never cooled. In Sedhem itself, a new sect arose, devotees of the balance, who prayed not to the sun but to the meeting of elements. They drew a spiral surrounded by rays and called it the sign of the joined breath. The priests burned their texts, but symbols have longer memories than kings. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered the lower vaults of Sharon, they found a chamber sealed with glass instead of stone. Within lay hundreds of tiny lamps arranged in a spiral. The oil in them had long dried, yet when air touched their wicks, a faint warmth stirred, as if some remnant of that first shared breath still lingered, waiting to be named again. Thus the tale of Valmir's fire reached its farthest horizon. The frost-born covenant that began in a hut of ash-crossed mountains, seas, and empires to become philosophy, faith, and finally myth. What had been survival became wisdom. What had been woman became archetype. In every culture touched by its echo, the same lesson whispered beneath different tongues. That power lives not in domination, but in the quiet exchange between opposites. When I walk beneath the southern sun and feel its mercy too fierce, I think of her, of Liana standing at the terrace's edge, calling clouds from an empty sky. And when northern winds bite through my coat, I remember that her mother once pressed a glowing stone to an infant's heart and refused despair. Between them, frost and fire learned each other's names. Their stories remind me that civilization itself is only this: a fragile warmth passed hand to hand, tested by every season, yet never entirely extinguished. We keep it as best we can. And somewhere, far beneath the shifting sands of Setham, I imagine the earth still remembers the footsteps of a girl who carried Valmir's last ember into the heart of the sun. The empire of Setham endured for 300 years after the queen's last decree. It glittered outwardly like a coin left too long in sunlight, all brilliance on its face and corrosion beneath. The priests regained their power first, as priests always do when kings grow weary. They forbade the speaking of the balance, striking the word from scrolls and temple stones. Those who practiced the breathing rites of Liana were made to confess under the gaze of burning mirrors. Yet knowledge, once breathed, cannot be unlearned. It lingers in muscle, in rhythm, in the instinct of a hand reaching for another hand. I have walked through the ruins of Sharon and seen the hieroglyphs chiseled shallowly where deeper marks once lay. The chisels could not erase the spiral, they only blurred its edges. The empire called this the Age of Correction. It was, as all such ages are, a time of fear disguised as piety. The markets still thrummed, the fountains still shone, but beneath the polished stones a faint unease coursed like groundwater. An understanding that the sun had begun to demand more worship than warmth could supply. Queen Aradel died childless. The council of regents that followed her turned rule into ceremony, ceremony into taxation, and taxation into hunger. They built ever higher towers of glass to magnify the sun's rays, claiming the light itself was divine gold. In these towers, noble families stored water that they no longer shared. The city that had once taught balance now learned hoarding. The priests called it prudence. The common people called it shadow. The rivers shrank. Amid this, whispers of Liana's return began to circulate. Sailors claimed to have seen a veiled woman at the edge of the northern desert where Setham's walls cast their last long shade. She carried no possessions, only a bowl of faintly smoking dust. When asked her name, she said, "I am what you have forgotten." Some knelt, others fled. The stories reached the court, and fear found its excuse. The high priest, now old and swollen with privilege, declared that the empire was haunted by the ghost of heresy. He decreed a purge of all symbols of the balance. Every mirror bearing the spiral mark was to be shattered. Every servant known to practice the cooling breath was to be banished. The edict spread faster than fire. For 3 nights the city rang with the breaking of glass. Light scattered in fragments across the sand, turning the streets into a sea of wounded suns. Among those taken was a young scribe named Ares. He had copied the scrolls of Maris for the palace archives, and in secret he had translated them into the tongue of the common folk. When the guards dragged him before the council, he spoke words that history preserved only in fragments. "You fear what keeps you alive." They executed him at dawn by heat. His body, consumed by the very sunlight they worshipped, became the empire's first martyr of warmth. The drought returned the following year, fiercer than before. The towers of glass, meant to concentrate divine favor, instead burned the crops in their fields. Winds from the northern mountains carried fine white ash, Valmir's forgotten breath, back across the sands, dimming the sky. The people saw it as omen, though none knew its source. Priests led processions through choking dust, chanting that sacrifice would restore purity. Families began to burn their own possessions, then their homes, believing smoke would draw mercy. It drew only darkness. In the third month of famine, rebellion flared in the lower districts. It began with the water-bearers, women who had once practiced the gentle alternation of hot and cool. They refused to fill the cisterns of the wealthy while children lay dying in dry streets. Their leader was a servant named Senna, said to be of northern blood. She carried a stone pendant that glowed faintly when the sun fell. Her followers called her Light of the Hollow Flame. Within weeks, half the city had joined her. They stormed the temples, tore down the mirrors, and filled them with sand. When the priests demanded repentance, she answered with the old northern phrase, "Fire does not ask who it warms." The rebellion consumed itself quickly. The empire, though rotting, still held an army. The soldiers marched under banners embroidered with golden rays, believing themselves chosen to cleanse impurity. They slaughtered the rebels, salted the wells, and raised pyres where the cooling rites had been practiced. The smoke that rose from those pyres darkened the sun for a season, and the soldiers thought they had won. In truth, the balance had already shifted beyond return. For when the winds cleared, the glass towers stood shattered. The heat they had magnified turned inward upon the city, cracking stone, melting roofs. Wells boiled, water turned bitter. Sharon burned not with flame but with light. By the year's end, its streets were rivers of glass. The empire's borders shrank to shadows of their former reach, and caravans no longer came. What was once the city of thousand mirrors became a husk of reflections. Yet even ruin carries seed. Survivors fled east into the mountains and north toward the colder lands. They took with them fragments of Liana's teaching, half remembered and mingled with prayer. In their exile they learned to rebuild with humility. They made shelters of stone that breathed both heat and coolness, shaping vents that imitated her balance of elements. They taught their children that warmth without restraint becomes wildfire, and that shadow without light is suffocation. The words changed, the tongue changed, but the rhythm endured. Civilization, though scorched, began again. I have held in my hand a relic from that migration. A clay bowl blackened on one side, pale on the other, discovered in the high passes. When placed before a flame, its dark side absorbs heat while the pale side stays cool. It is a small miracle of memory, fashioned by those who fled but did not forget. Even the shape of the bowl recalls the valley's first hearths, as though history itself were circling home. Some say the stranger who brought the blue dust returned once more in that age of ash. Others claim he was never a man at all, but the embodied will of equilibrium, stepping through centuries whenever one side of creation grows too heavy. The chronicler in me hesitates at such tales, yet the wind of the desert carries a sound that resembles breath, and I cannot wholly disbelieve. In the end, Sedhem collapsed not from war or plague but from imbalance. Its people had turned the gift of warmth into a weapon of hierarchy, just as Valmir once turned faith into law. The frost of greed can bite as deep as winter itself. When the last survivors looked back from the northern ridges, they saw only a field of light so bright it resembled snow. Thus the empire that worshipped the sun froze to death in its own brilliance. I often think of Liana in those final days, whether she lived to witness the fall, or had long since become dust upon the wind. Perhaps she watched unseen as Sedhem devoured itself, her eyes reflecting both pity and comprehension. Perhaps she understood that no flame, however sacred, can endure without its shadow. If so, she would have wept not for the city, but for the repeating pattern of the human heart. For every age builds its temples from the same twin fears, the fear of cold and the fear of dark. And every age forgets that warmth and light are not possessions, but relationships, delicate, mortal, constantly negotiated. When either side is denied, collapse is not punishment, it is return. So the chronicles end with silence, as they must. The sands of Sedhem drift over marble and memory alike, muffling the echoes of rebellion and prayer. But sometimes, at dusk, when the heat leaves the ground and the stars begin to breathe, travelers swear they see a faint glow beneath the dunes. A spiral of dull red embers, pulsing like a heartbeat under glass. They say it is the last remainder of the balance, waiting patiently for the next world to remember how to share its warmth. Centuries passed as they always do, slowly at first and then all at once. Sand covered the bones of Sethem, moss grew over the stones of Valmir, and history folded them both into legend. Yet memory has a way of refusing extinction. It hides in gestures, in habits we call ordinary, in the strange persistence of words that outlive their meanings. And so the covenant of warmth, born in a frozen hut and buried beneath a desert sun, found its way into the bloodstream of the world. Scholars will tell you it began again with an accident. In the year 2023 of our current reckoning, a team of archaeologists digging near the old Nile Delta uncovered a chamber sealed by heat rather than stone. Inside were scroll fragments written in two hands, one angular and northern, one flowing and southern. Their ink had fused to the papyrus like veins of black glass. When translated, the lines formed a prayer neither to a god nor to a nation, but to the exchange of breath itself. It spoke of the meeting of frost and flame, of the duty to share warmth among strangers. In its margin, faint but legible, appeared a single name, Liana of Valmir. The discovery was dismissed at first as coincidence. Historians argued that the northern script was too ancient, the desert tongue too evolved, for both to coexist. Yet the carbon dating refused obedience to theory. The fragments were real, and they whispered of a history that connected opposites. The press named it, the miracle of two fires. Museums competed for pieces. For a season, the world looked backward, and in that looking some remembered what the ancestors had nearly perfected, the science of care. In universities, new disciplines arose, thermocultural anthropology, ritual ecology, names to make faith respectable again. Scientists studied the ancient breath patterns of Valmir and discovered they aligned with modern techniques of thermal regulation. Physicians found that alternating heat and cool could steady a failing heart. Economists, always quick to domesticate wonder, began using the phrase, the warmth economy, to describe networks of mutual aid. Old metaphors turned literal, and literal truths became moral again. Still, history does not repeat, it rhymes like a half-forgotten song. As knowledge spread, so too did rivalry. Corporations sought patents on thermal technology inspired by the balance. They built machines that stored warmth in crystal, selling it by subscription to the shivering poor. Cities lit themselves with captured light and called it progress. And once again, a few owned what should have belonged to all. I have walked through such cities at night. Their towers gleam with artificial suns while the streets below lie in shadow. When you touch the walls, they pulse faintly, warm but indifferent, like the breath of a sleeping beast that dreams only of profit. There are others who remember differently. In northern villages rebuilt after the ice floods, people gather each solstice around communal fires. They bring stones from their homes, heated in simple stoves, and pile them in the center until the mound glows red. Children press their palms against it. Elders whisper the ancient refrain, rest but do not fade. They do not call it religion. They call it continuity. To them, Liana and Mira are not saints but ancestors of empathy, proof that compassion once saved a world from freezing. Far south, in the reclaimed deserts, engineers have raised towers modeled on the lost halls of Sethem. These towers absorb sunlight by day and release it by night, keeping settlements habitable. At the heart of each tower burns a controlled plasma they name the Ember. No one agrees who first proposed the design, yet every blueprint bears a spiral watermark. Some say it was an aesthetic flourish. I suspect it was memory trying again. Even language carries the echo. We speak of warm data, cold wars, hot takes, unaware that these metaphors trace back to a single mythic grammar of temperature and morality. Our idioms reveal the ghost of Valmir in every tongue. When we call someone warm-hearted or describe generosity as radiant, we repeat the theology of our ancestors without knowing it. The systems they built collapsed, yet their vocabulary survived, shaping how we feel truth. Sometimes I think civilization itself is a conversation between those who hoard warmth and those who share it. We invent new tools, electric grids, global markets, digital networks, each promising to spread light more widely, yet somehow the distribution remains uneven. We are clever at kindling but clumsy at sharing. Perhaps that is the lesson buried in every collapse. Technology without tenderness is only another form of frost. And yet, I have hope. I have seen people revive the old rites in modern shapes. In hospitals, nurses place heated stones wrapped in cloth beside premature infants, echoing Myra's gesture without knowing her name. In disaster zones, volunteers form human chains to pass solar batteries hand to hand, their faces lit by the glow of devices that hold both heat and light. The forms have changed, but the instinct endures. We are creatures of exchange, born to breathe warmth into one another. There are even those who call themselves ashkeepers again, not as priests but as caretakers of memory. They tend communal stoves in refugee camps, they build geothermal wells in Arctic towns, they teach that energy is relationship, not resource. They say that to keep a fire alive you must give part of your own breath. When I stood among them one winter night, watching steam rise from a single shared pot, I felt the centuries fall away. It was Valmir again, rebuilt not in stone but in practice. And what of Setham? Its ruins still sleep beneath the sand, but satellites have found traces of heat far below, lines of warmth running like veins beneath the dunes. Scientists call them geothermal anomalies. Poets call them the pulse. Every few years, when the desert wind is still and the air cools enough to listen, those who camp nearby swear they hear a low humming, like a deep impatient breath. Some say it is the earth exhaling the memory of balance. Others say it is the stranger's dust, still working. Whatever it is, it reminds me that no story truly ends. Every civilization leaves behind both ash and ember, and the future decides which to tend. We have inherited both frost and flame. Our task is the same as theirs, to keep one from devouring the other. Perhaps that is why I write, why I sift through broken tablets and half-burned scrolls. To learn how warmth survives corruption, how generosity resists gravity. To remember that systems fail, but intention endures. When I touch the ancient stones of Valmir's ruins, they are cold. Yet beneath the chill I feel a faint pulse, as though the mountain itself still holds its breath. I press my palm there and imagine Liana's final words. Fire does not ask who it warms. In that sentence lies both warning and invitation. The warning is simple, control leads to collapse. The invitation is quieter, share and live. So I leave my hand against the stone a moment longer, until my skin grows numb. Somewhere far below, the old ember answers, rising through rock and memory alike. And for that brief instant, I believe that the warmth of a single touch might still change the world. Night has fallen as I write this. The lamps hum softly, electric imitations of the ancient hearth. Outside my window the city glitters, each apartment a square of fragile warmth stacked against the dark. If you listen closely, the traffic below sounds almost like wind through frozen reeds. The same wind that once crossed Valmir's valley, carrying smoke and song. History is never as distant as we think. It sleeps under our fingernails, it whispers in the glow of our devices, it waits to be remembered. I close my eyes and picture the first hut. The woman presses a glowing stone to her child's chest. The fire gasps, catches, endures. Across continents and millennia, another woman walks barefoot across marble that remembers the desert's heat. Between them stretches all that humanity has built, cities, empires, machines, and the endless repetition of the same small prayer. Let this warmth not die. The forms change, the names fade, but the plea remains constant. We are still their descendants, still tending the same uncertain flame. Sometimes, when I visit the museums that house the fragments of Valmir and Sethem, I stand before the glass and watch the reflections. The scrolls lie silent, the bowls cracked, the stones dulled by centuries, yet my own image wavers across them like firelight. I think of Liana bending over her books in the Queen's library, of Mira carrying embers from door to door, of unnamed ashkeepers counting breaths so that others might sleep. I think of the stranger with eyes like coal who vanished into snow. Their stories are mine now, as yours are mine, for memory shared becomes present tense. What did they teach us? Not theology, not empire. They taught that survival is a conversation, not a conquest. They showed that warmth is most powerful when it circulates, that hoarded light suffocates its keeper. They warned, though none wished to listen, that balance is not peace but vigilance. And they left behind a choice disguised as a myth, to be fire, frost, or breath between. Each generation answers anew. I sometimes imagine what might come after us. Perhaps our descendants will find the remnants of our own cities, steel bones half buried in sand, and wonder what prayers we spoke. Perhaps they will read our circuits and satellites as we read Valmir's spirals, mistaking technology for faith and faith for technology. Perhaps they will see that we, too, worship light and feared dark, that we built towers to concentrate it, that we forgot the lesson until collapse reminded us. And perhaps, in some ruined library, one will find this chronicle and smile at its earnestness, the way I once smiled at the myths of old. If they do, I hope they will also feel the warmth behind the words. Because that is all any record can be, a vessel for heat. We write to keep breath moving, to turn memory into kindling. The lines on these pages are veins, the ink within them, blood. Even now, as the letters fade on the screen, a faint radiance lingers, the digital ghost of a campfire. Somewhere, you are reading it, and the warmth passes between us unseen. That is enough. That is continuity. Outside, the temperature has dropped. The buildings breathe mist into the night. I think of the ashkeepers and their nightly vow. Rest but do not fade. It was never just a prayer to fire, it was a promise to each other. Keep watch, share breath, do not let indifference freeze what love once lit. We have no great ember now, no goddess to scold us, only this fragile network of hearts and wires and words. Yet even that, if tended, can burn bright enough to be seen from space. So tonight, as your room grows quiet and your screen begins its slow descent into black, remember her words, Myra's, Liana's, all the women who carried the impossible torch through storm and sand. Fire does not ask who it warms. Let them echo through the circuits and the bones alike. Let them remind you that to be human is to be temporary and generous in the same breath. The wind rises again, rattling the windowpane. It sounds like the crackle of kindling. I imagine it moving over the ruins of Sharon, stirring grains of glass that once were mirrors. Each grain catches starlight for a heartbeat, 1,000 miniature suns trembling on the edge of extinction. Then darkness reclaims them, gentle as a hand closing over flame. I will not call it an ending. The old stories never end, they only shift shape. Somewhere a child is born tonight beside a heater's hum, and a parent watches the blush of warmth return to their skin. Somewhere a scientist perfects a battery that stores sunlight for the poor. Somewhere an elder sits beside a candle, whispering to no one in particular, rest but do not fade. These are the same acts wearing new names. The secret world of queens and servants still turns, invisible but alive, its currency still breath, its law still balance. When you extinguish your light after reading this, do it slowly. Watch the glow shrink to a single point before it dies. That point is history, small, stubborn, waiting. It will return with dawn, disguised as an ordinary morning, asking only that you remember. And if you listen then, very carefully, you may hear beneath the hum of modern life a low, rhythmic murmur, the pulse of every fire that ever was. Keep the lights low, keep the warmth moving, and when cold finds you, as it always does, breathe in through the nose, out through the heart. The old pattern still works. It always has.